This is Scientist Rebellion.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of the series Buen Vivir. The Buen Vivir campaign includes a monthly series of talks on global, social, and climate justice. Buen Vivir is the most common translation for the indigenous Quechua concept of sumac causai, life lived in harmony with nature and community. While it is sometimes translated into English as a good life, Buen Vivir relates to a deeper understanding of how humankind and the impacts of our lives affect the planet and each other. The monthly talk series will feature expert speakers in facilitated discussion addressing Buen Vivir issues affecting the world's working populations. The speakers will alternate from Global South and Global North regions, bringing together the voices of the most affected and those who benefit, connecting the dots of our impacts. By illuminating and linking the effects of continuing unjust extractivism on the lives, livelihoods, and resource-rich physical lands of Global South peoples, and discussing the many opportunities to address the impacts, we hope to position the social justice issue clearly at the center of the climate justice conversation in Turtle Island and beyond. For today, we are gonna hear from Gabriella Cabaña. Gabriela is a sociologist and social anthropologist with a Ph.D. from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her research has focused on environmental justice, renewable energy infrastructure, and degrowth from a Global South perspective. Gabriela is currently a researcher at Fundación Tantí, an NGO based in Antofagasta, north of Chile. She is also an advocate of universal basic income. So please, Gabriela, go ahead.
Thank you, Claudio. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation and also for being here and joining me for this lecture that I hope will be an introduction to degrowth. I'm hearing a bit of background noise. Maybe it's your microphone, Claudio, from the cafe. Great, much better. Thank you for that. Okay, so what I'm gonna try to do is to give you a brief presentation. I hope it would take maybe 45 minutes if all goes well, hopefully a bit less so we can have more time to discuss. And in conversation before, while preparing this lecture, I proposed to give this lecture about anti-colonial degrowth and to start speaking about degrowth from this anti-colonial lens, which is my personal approach. So it's very much informed by that, and it's meant as an introduction to this concept. Maybe for both of you that haven't familiarized yet with what degrowth means and what it means for me as a researcher and also as an activist. Okay, so before I start point zero, I want to tell you a bit about myself and how I have approached degrowth. So I'm Chilean. I am speaking to you from the capital of Chile, Santiago. And as Claudio was telling you, currently a researcher at Fundación Tantí, and came to know about degrowth during my anthropology studies in London in 2017. It was back then still very niche and small, but it has grown to be a rich field of research today. And I have engaged with degrowth as part of my academic and activist work, and this distinction is often blurred to me. So I'll tell you more about this towards the end of the lecture. And what you can see here is me during a recent field work in the north of Chile, in Antofagasta, in a beautiful area in the locality of Taltal, that I hope I can tell you more about towards the end of this session. So first, I'm going to divide this lecture in 3 parts, and each part will have its own conclusions. And then I hope we can open the floor for questions. So first, what is degrowth? I want to define it briefly. I want to speak about degrowth and anti-coloniality, and I want to go more concretely into my own research about what does it mean to apply degrowth in research and in action. So let's go with the first. What is degrowth? So I like saying that degrowth is multiple things. It is first a confluence of critiques to growth with capital G. That's why I use it to differentiate just organic growth of any kind from the growth ideology that degrowth is interested in critiquing. Second, it is also a set of political and ethical perspectives for social ecological transformation. And finally, it is also a perspective for doing research. And I will touch upon each of these things. So if you don't know about this book and you want to hear, if you want to understand why degrowth can be understood as a confluence of critiques, I strongly recommend you this book called The Future is Degrowth. In my opinion, it's the best book, at least that has been published so far about degrowth, and has like a really good introduction. If you don't know about this book and you want to I'm hearing myself. Okay, but now it's gone. And it explains the confluences on degrowth, right? So it is important to remember that the ideology of growthism that became tangible as an economic doctrine in the post-Second World War period with the creation of the Bretton Woods Agreement has been criticized for as long as it has existed. Indeed, the same person that created GDP, Simon Kuznets, warned that the indicator should not be used as a measure of the welfare of a nation. But this is exactly what it has become. And under this new international cooperation agreement, GDP measurement and changes imposed a regime of international relations that devalued certain areas for the benefit of others. And here, I'm not going to read the table, but I think you can see that many of these critiques predate degrowth as a concept. Degrowth is a relatively new concept, but what I want to say is that the ideology of economic growth has always been criticized. We can find different traditions of critique. Now, what is another element that is fundamental is the role of social ecological economics. And what do I mean by this? So this is worth explaining because most of us are exposed to neoclassical economics and the subdiscipline that it's environmental economics. And this is very different from ecological economics. So I wanted to explain what it means. Social ecological economics, and this is a slight modification that Clive Spash does when he speaks about ecological economics, to never forget the social dimension of it. So that's why I also use the social ecological name for it. Different to what neoclassical economics does, social ecological economics understand this object that we understand as the economy, quote unquote, right? Because it's an objectification. It doesn't actually exist. It is an object of knowledge. It puts that in a wider society, and that society also embedded in nature, reversing the order that we usually have when we think about the economy as the center surrounded by nature and society. Here is actually embedded in both society and nature. Now, this apparently very simple framing is important because nature has its own working. Social ecological economics incorporated the role of ecosystems and biophysical principles like entropy, famously, that is the decreasing availability of energy for doing useful work. This is relevant to understand, for instance, how our capitalist civilization has become reliant on high-density fuels, that is fossil fuels, for its working, turning into a high modernist civilization that needs constant supply of this form of energy for sustaining itself. Here, you see, no, I had some, okay, yeah, you can see, yeah, those are the images I wanted you to see. So fossil fuels are unusual accumulations of energy stocks, and using that stock has direct and indirect consequences, for instance, climate breakdown being one of the indirect. Moreover, it also makes us dependent on continuing accessing similar sources of energies into the future. Now, none of this information about how the materiality of our energy systems is restricted by its biophysical nature, it's taken into consideration in mainstream economics. That means that energy as an issue, broadly speaking, is flattened. Now, in degrowth, ecological economics is particularly important for the debate around the possibility of green growth that you might have heard of, which is the most famous and mainstream competitor of degrowth, I should say. For traditional economics, that reduces the ecology to the mere environment. In environmental economics, the fix to our current ecological disaster is green growth. That is, if I should define it, a form of growth that is quote-unquote cleaner and that can be sustained and that can sustain the perpetual expansion of economic activity while decreasing carbon and material footprint, right? This is the idea of green growth. But one of the premises of degrowth is that green growth is actually not happening. Not even in places that claim to be doing it. And yes, that's the graph I wanted you to see. And this graph shows how closely related both are. This is probably the most quoted paper on degrowth. If you want to check it out, it's already a couple of years old, but it addresses the question of green growth and shows how coupled the material footprint and global GDP are. So as I said, this graph shows how closely related both are and has been fundamental for showing how the expansion of renewable energies, for instance, hasn't decreased the use of fossil fuels, which is very important when we speak about energy transitions that is not actually happening. We're seeing an energy addition, and that's a fundamental point in degrowth. Now, this more recent paper reinforces this point, and I really recommend you to check it out if you're interested in the possibility of decoupling. This paper shows that even in places where there is some decoupling, this is not happening at the pace and depth that we need to achieve the very necessary climate goals. The important question to ask about green growth is not so much that it can exist, but if it can be done quickly to the degree needed, and that it doesn't rely on the shifting of pollution and emissions to other countries, which is what is currently happening, right? So the question of green growth can be unpacked and is more complicated than we think usually. Now, this paper is only about emissions and mitigation curves that align with the Paris Agreement, but other papers also factor in a material footprint analysis. So what you can see in these graphs is what is the actually existing decoupling showing, the trajectories of decoupling. For instance, in these cases, the orange line that you see here. But what is also showing is what the necessary decoupling should be, which is this curve here below, which you can see is much sharper than the one that it's happening. So yes, some degree of decoupling is happening, but not necessary to stay, to actually reach our climate goals. So this is a kind of debate and research that is being pushed by degrowth academics. Now, let's focus more on the last 10 years and speak about degrowth as an activist slogan and as a research agenda. And here, I always like sharing that degrowth as a term was coined in a very specific setting as an activist slogan, but now it has evolved to gather an eclectic mix of proposals and activist movements. So 10 years ago, a group of activists for car-free cities in Lyon, France, talked about sustainable degrowth instead of sustainable growth, and it was done in this magazine that you can see here. And they were criticizing this idea of sustainable growth because as a slogan, it had back then already shown to be ineffective as a recipe for change at the international and more local policy level. So there was from the beginning, I want to emphasize this, there was from the beginning an internationalist aspect, not just not in my backyard activism. The first writings of degrowth from Serge Latouche, for instance, speak about decolonizing our imaginaries from modernist ideas of progress, and he explicitly acknowledged the existence of an anti- or post-development international that, and I quote here from his book, has been analyzing and denouncing the harmful effects of development in Africa. This is from his book, Farewell to Growth. And in his book, he also quotes thinkers from Africa themselves that had been pushing forward these ideas. Other important precedents that have been incorporated into the genealogy of degrowth. Sorry, I got lost in my notes. Yeah, incorporated into the genealogy of degrowth, other than the already mentioned ecological economics, which is very important, is the Limits to Growth report, which has had a sort of revival recently. It's become more and more discussed. Every now and then, this report is rediscovered. There is a lot of this system thinking incorporated into degrowth. You might be familiar with this report, so I'm not going to go deeper into that. And finally, the book that you see on the right, the Degrowth, A Vocabulary for a New Era, was, in my opinion, a watershed moment in bringing together already existing critical thinking and alternative to development to think under this concept. And here comes the idea of degrowth as an umbrella concept that can somehow gather critical perspectives in different ways. And here I also put the image of the Ecological Economics Journal in case you want to learn more about degrowth research. I would say most of the most interesting research is being published there. So it's a good journal to just look into if you want to see a more academic side of this perspective. Now, I want to speak very briefly about some principles of degrowth, and I think this is a good way of getting a taste of the political sentiment that underpins degrowth, which I think is very important. So I'm leaving anti-coloniality in the background because I'm going to touch on this point in the next section of the lecture. So the first concept limits. So the first concept is limits. And I think this is crucial, and I always mention it, and maybe we can speak about this more later in the discussion. So the growth starts from the perspective that we live on a finite planet, and that limits are part of our human condition. Rather than denying facts, the fact that the Earth is limited, the growth takes the acceptance of limits as a liberatory act, right? That only accepting that reality we can actually aim to be free. Very importantly here, limits are not understood just as being objective or out there. You know, they're not written in nature, but rather what we consider to be a limit comes from collective decisions on how we want to live. And I think this is a very important question, a philosophical and political question. Now, the next concept is conviviality, or what is also called sometimes tools for conviviality. And this is an approach to think about societies, but also about technologies. We speak about convivial societies and convivial technologies. And this, here I read from a book by Nelson Lanligue, and they explain this concept saying that conviviality is a central concept for degrowth, coined and developed by Ivan Illich. As a practice, it means a cooperative, mutual, sociable, and sharing approach. As a characteristic of societies, it means that citizens, not experts or technocrats, directly control technologies and institutions, so that technologies are selected to serve the common interest and do not breach the counterproductivity threshold. And I think that in times like this, when we get surrounded by propaganda about technology, remembering this dimension of technology is fundamental. And this is very central to degrowth. The next concept is care. And the principle of care is taken from feminist economics and feminist critiques to the economy as a discipline and as a perspective that devaluates and exploits care work. Degrowth is often described as a care-centered economy where care will be supported, distributed, and decommodified. The next concept is sufficiency. And sufficiency is first a way of resisting the constant push for efficiency and productivity, a way of balancing the default belief that more is always better. And here I read again from the vocabulary book that I showed you before. It says, voluntary simplicity can be understood to imply a way of life that involves consciously minimizing wasteful and resource-intensive consumption. But it is also about reimagining the good life by directing progressively more time and energy toward pursuing non-materialistic sources of satisfaction and meaning. In other words, voluntary simplicity involves embracing a minimally sufficient, unquote, material standard of living in exchange for more time and freedom to pursue other life goals, such as community or social engagements, more time with family, artistic or intellectual projects, home-based production, more fulfilling employment, political participation, spiritual exploration, relaxation, pleasure-seeking, and so on, none of which need to rely on money or much money. And I think that's a beautiful definition of voluntary simplicity.
Gabriella,
Next, yes?
the interpreter has asked if you could speak just a little bit slower. She's doing
Okay.
simultaneous. Thank you.
Great. Yes, thank you. And sorry for the interpreter. This happens to me often. I will try to go slower. So the next and final concept is radical abundance, which is also sometimes called frugal abundance. You can find it called in both ways. So this concept starts from an acknowledgement that capitalism does not actually solve, unquote, scarcity, because under capitalism, there is never enough. Scarcity is created on purpose and must be policed. It has to be enforced. As an alternative, building radical abundance is building public wealth. And here I read from Jason Hickel, who says, by de-enclosing and expanding the commons, and by redistributing existing income more fairly, we can enable people to access the goods that they need to live well without needing high levels of income and therefore additional growth in order to do so. This is from an article by Jason Hickel in 2019. This is an important concept to emphasize that degrowth is not the same as austerity and as austerity economics. And this is crucial because it gets conflated sometimes. It is about changing the system that makes us live in artificial scarcity. So the next thing I wanted to show you after these concepts is to show that degrowth is today a thriving research field. And this paper is a bit old already, but I think it shows how different disciplines are addressing the question that degrowth represents as an alternative, as a transformation, as an agenda for transformation of society. So maybe if you are in some of these disciplines, you can find yourself in this map. So here you can see how these questions interact. So I want to finish this first section with a working definition of degrowth, because I know that so far I haven't defined it. So this is a way of finishing this first part of the lecture. So this is a preliminary definition. It says, degrowth calls for rich nations to scale down throughput to sustainable levels, reducing aggregate energy use to enable a sufficiently rapid transition to renewables, and reducing aggregate resource use to reverse ecological breakdown. This demand is not just about ecology. Rather, it is rooted in anti-colonial principles. Again, as Hickel explains in this quote, this is not only about the outcomes of growth not being good enough, not being sufficient, but it's about how the mechanisms of appropriation it's about the mechanisms of appropriation of nature that sustain growth as a moral imperative. So this is a definition for you. So what is degrowth? Conclusions of this section. There have been critiques of growth for as long as there has been growth as a social and political project. The economy, as an object, is not a fact of nature, and all economy is political. And whoever tells you it's not, it's probably has a hidden agenda somehow. And finally, degrowth is not recession or anti-technology. It's rather about making peace with nature. So now I'm moving to the second section of this lecture, which is degrowth and anti-coloniality. And I address this question because it's always asked to me, and it's about who needs to degrow, right? When we speak about degrowth, who we're saying should degrow the way they are living. And I want to start by saying that the problem, it's oppression at all levels, and this should be our guiding principle. So right now, we live in an extremely unequal society. And I like this figure because it's a good reminder that the problem we're facing is not people or overpopulation, but rather an unsustainable way of living that only a minority can afford to have today. These minorities, wherever they are, must be the first ones to think about degrowth towards the future, right? So we should speak about degrowing this top 1% of income earners that have a significantly major piece of the pie of all these things, of all these emissions in this case. But this correlates with other elements of the technology. Sorry, of the use of materials, not just emissions. Now, nonetheless, rearranging our global society to degrow would affect everyone, not just the rich, and not just those that would have to reduce their luxury consumption, but also how impoverished countries today seek their way into social justice. That is what we often speak of as development. So we cannot continue to develop, quote unquote, by aiming at reproducing the Western-centric imperial way of living, which is now present not only in the global north, but increasingly among global south elites. So we need to define safe planetary boundaries, but also local boundaries. And here's the next graph I wanted to show you. As you can see here, inequality is not only between countries, but also inside countries. Playing with numbers in the big picture, it's fundamental, but not enough. The degrowth is about restoring ecosystems, returning sovereignty to dispossessed people, and taking away power from corporations and the states concentrating military power. In other words, it's not asking those holding little to nothing today to live under even more meager conditions. It is about, as I mentioned before, a different form of abundance, not the one based on private property that we have today. And here I just wanted to show how much you have of a range, especially in highly unequal countries where as rich as they can be and as much as the top 10%, for instance, can contribute highly to emissions, you also have a significant majority that is contributing very little. So speaking at a broadly country level is usually insufficient to grasp the magnitude of the challenge that we have ahead. Now, there is another dimension that I wanted to touch upon, which is an example of the relations that we need to dismantle through degrowth. And one of them is the currently unequal exchange of labor. So here in this graph, you can see that there is an appropriation in absolute terms of labor from the global north over global south human capacities. That means that effectively, a significant number of our working hours in the global south go to contribute to the well-being in the global north. And one of the things we need to do to think about degrowth societies is to recover that capacity to think and design societies for ourselves in the global south. As a radical redistribution project, degrowth will mean that all those resources and labor capacity currently being funneled for the benefit of the rich under the form of excessive, noxious, and not even enjoyable forms of expenditure very often, will become once again our commons to be taken care of and nourished. Now, this goes to the relation between degrowth and post-extractivism and how I like to think about this as a global north and global south alliance. So we have defined degrowth as an effort to dismantle an ideology, the idea of pursuing growth at all costs as the only vehicle for human flourishing. In that sense, degrowth is for all. I mean, for everyone, for the planet, right? But what does that mean? More than thinking about consumption in broad terms, which we can also do, I think it is better to think in terms of appropriation and the mechanisms that sustain the appropriation of nature. And for this, I think this point of extractivism and post-extractivism is useful. And I would like to engage now very briefly in the Latin American tradition of extractivism and the idea of transitioning into post-extractivism, because they speak closely to degrowth. So extractivism, sometimes referred to in the plural as extractivisms, refers to a family of critiques of the political economy of resource use that starts from the questioning of understanding nature first and foremost as a resource. I think that's a broad definition. And in a nutshell, and this is what you see in the screen now, it's my own definition from a couple of years ago, extractivism refers to the actualization and enhancement of a colonial matrix of production in the Capitalocene that transforms the corpo materialities of the global south in raw material for the global market. So that's in very broad terms what extractivism means. Now, if we take a brief historic gaze, we can say that rendering nature a resource was a colonial project. To an extent, it can be tracked back 500 years ago to the colonization of what we now call the Americas. Extractivist thinkers see the process of state building in the 20th century in particular as a continuation of the same extractive relations that supported the imperialist appropriation of indigenous land, most of the time with the labor of enslaved people from Africa. Extractivism is noxious in the destruction it does to the web of life and in the hierarchical differences it creates among people. So it is a system that differentiates, creates differences of qualities of humans. These distinctions are part of the same structure of power. Extractivism also relegates places in the global south, like Latin America, to a subordinated position in the geopolitical order. And here is just a classic image of the silver mines of Potosí. Now, a more recent iteration of this concept, which we can call the new extractivisms or neo-extractivisms, it's also referred to sometimes, emerged as a reaction to the early 2000s pink tide in Latin American governments. So this idea of new extractivism tries to reactualize this original notion of extractivism that emerged, as I told you, going back to the colonial time. So it was originally formulated around the emblematic case of mining, for mineral mining and oil. But more recently, as you can see here with the case of soy, as resource exploitation has become more sophisticated in some dimensions, the idea of extractivism has been reformulated and updated to catch up with the most recent event. So here I just want to mention Maristela Svampa, who I think is the key thinker to understand new extractivisms. And she speaks about neo-extractivism in relation with what she calls the commodity consensus, which is a model of development that moves from the Washington consensus, based on financial valorization, to large-scale export of raw materials. So she says, and here I quote, "The commodities consensus is a complex, fast-paced, recursive process and must be read from multiple perspectives. From an economic point of view, it has involved a process of reprimarization of Latin American economies, emphasizing their reorientation toward mainly extractive or rent-based activities with little added value." And she concludes that the construction of large hydroelectric dams, the expansion of the fishing and forestry frontier, and the generalization of the agribusiness model are part of this, soy and biofuels, for example. So this is important because we don't see just privatization, for instance. We also see sometimes that the state is the one leading these extractive projects. And in doing that, they endorse this notion that resource exploitation is inevitable. It's like a revealed destiny of Latin America. And this form of neo-developmentalism can come from progressive and more liberal regimes as well, and consolidates unsustainable models of development. And I wanted to speak about this idea by Eduardo Gudinas, because I think it's really clarifying to me, at least. And he speaks about this idea of the compensatory state, always in the context of new extractivisms. So Gudinas analyzes a regional turn towards state control of natural resources that nevertheless remains extractive. He says that the revenues that come from extraction and export become a justification for the intensification of extractivism. In other words, extraction of raw materials is seen as a vehicle to capture profit coming from it, directly or indirectly, by the state to fund social programs. This can even take the form of an anti-imperialist project with nationalistic undertones and be justified as such, right? So I have the right to exploit my oil, for instance, and to give support to my people, and not let people from outside take that money. So for Gudinas, when this perspective is taken up by progressive governments, this results, and this is the quote on the screen, this results in a state always caught between contradictions and tensions to promote economic growth and to regulate the market, to accept the conditions set by foreign investors and to attend to the demands of local citizens, and to sell natural resources on global markets, but to question the capitalist system. And here also increased access to consumption is made equivalent to well-being. And this dynamic is reproduced further on. Now, new extractivisms or neo-extractivisms are concepts that also seek to explain the expansion of extractivist logics into new arenas. For example, I have done research in Chiloé, in the south of Chile. Salmon farming has been studied as a form of neo-extractivism, even though it's not the extraction of a resource that was there. It's a kind of farming of the sea, right? It's a plantation of the sea, because it's a species that is not indigenous to that land. So this kind of industry is part of a larger trend in which the new demand for energy at a global level pushes the exploitation of previously untapped resources, like unconventional fossil fuels via hydraulic fracturing in Argentina. You know, the advancements of fracking. That would be another example. And here I want to move to the topic of energy, because it's my current research, and to speak about the new extractivism that we are seeing under the banner of renewable energy. This dynamic, this process, is also sometimes referred to as renewable extractivism or even green extractivism. The picture that you see here in the background is how the inner valley of the Taltal sector of Antofagasta, where I'm currently working, is looking today with the expansion of wind farms. The idea of supporting a so-called, because again, I want to question, this is not really happening, but the so-called energy transition out of fossil fuels has meant the demand for new empty land that can become productive. And we see the final constellation like this: a continuation of the commodification of nature, even under supposedly nature-friendly agendas. The need for continuous expansion ends up exerting violence into nature. In this scenario, I want to say degrowth is an exit. So in all the constellation, degrowth can be a way out. And here I want to recommend an important book by Ulrich Brandt and Alberto Acosta, two important thinkers of degrowth and post-extractivism, who write this book saying that these two traditions are a way out of the capitalist labyrinth. So if you can read Spanish, I recommend the book. It's called Salidas del laberinto capitalista, or Ways Out of the Capitalist Labyrinth. So degrowth is an alternative to all these processes I've been telling you. Right. I am going to move a bit faster here. Apologies to the translator, but I might just skip a couple of points because I really want to reach number 3. So I'm going to speak a bit more now about the coloniality of climate breakdown, about impacts, mitigation, and green sacrifice zones. And here, I'm sure if you are in this session, you are familiar with what we can call one dimension of the coloniality of climate breakdown, which is the fact that the people that contributed the least to this mess are now being disproportionately more affected by the consequences. So this is one dimension. But the other dimension I want to discuss here now with you is the fact that they are also, or we are also paying the price in the mitigation processes. That is, that the environmental cost of trying to reach, allegedly, the climate goals are also being suffered more by the Global South. So here, this is just a graphic explanation of how climate coloniality is also a form of atmospheric appropriation, right? So there is inequality in how much pollution different countries have contributed into in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And here on the left, you see the ones that are within fair shares. And here you see the ones that are, beyond that, if we were to equalize between countries. So it gives you a sense of who have benefited from this process of pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, I wanted to speak more about land appropriation in mitigation pathways, which is what I was telling you. And I just wanted to give one example, which is that more and more in different mitigation pathways, we are seeing this area below the curve, which is technologies that are supposed to absorb emissions from the environment, what we call negative emissions technologies. And this more and more is being proposed under technologies that are experimental, that are not proven at scale, but we are more and more planning to fulfill these climate goals, not so much by reducing our emissions, but by increasing the amount of emissions we can then capture back. And here, just to give you an example, the technology of BECCS, which means bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, is completely irrational in my view, but it's about growing trees for making them, turning them into fuel, then burning that as biomass, capture the CO2, and then use that CO2 again to create fuel or to just store it and not allow it to go back to the atmosphere. And this is supposed to improve, to diminish the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And of course, all of this would mean an immense use of land, of energy, and of materials to create this very rational, in my view, strategy to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So all of this, of course, will be done in land considered useless or available for this kind of thing. And what I think Degrowth is doing interestingly when the prevalent is this kind of research is to create different scenarios of climate mitigation that include this perspective of degrowth. And here is just a critique of this BECCS deployment that I was showing you that says that large-scale negative emissions deployment faces numerous and substantial risks for sustainability and feasibility. BECCS is associated with major land use change and its potential negative side effects, the further transgression of several planetary boundaries, especially biodiversity. So this is already being denounced from degrowth perspectives. And yet this is a project, I'm not going to mention this, I'm not going to play it, but if you want to check this out, this speaks about the place where I work. If you want to learn more about what's happening in the arid ecosystems of the Antofagasta region, you can learn about this. I wanted to share it with you. So the conclusions of this section are that degrowth is at its core a project for democratizing the economy, because we said the economy was political, so we need to democratize it, right? And that committing to growth, even from the Global South, will lock in the same exploitative dynamics. So we need to think of post-extractivist alternatives. Now I wanted to finish very briefly, because I'm running out of time, of how I'm applying degrowth right now in my existing research. So first, no, I'm going to skip the part of Chiloé, and I'm going to go straight to energy transitions and hydrogen, which is what I'm doing right now in the north of Chile. So I'm going to say a few words about hydrogen. If you haven't heard about hydrogen, this energy vector is being promoted in Chile and in other places as one of the key pieces for decarbonization into the future. Hydrogen can be used as a fuel, and it doesn't produce greenhouse gases when it's burned, and it can also be produced in a way that it's supposedly carbon neutral when you use the process of electrolysis and you electrolyze, you run electricity through water, right? And if this electricity comes from renewable energy sources, we speak about green hydrogen. This was promoted in Chile, has been promoted in Chile since 2020. And what you're seeing flashing on the left is a project that I did with some colleagues in 2021, because we were really worried that this idea of exporting green hydrogen, of becoming an exporter of renewable energy through hydrogen to the world, had been done without really thinking about limits, without thinking about where all this infrastructure would be, what resources it would use, what water it would use in an incredibly water-stressed country. And we wanted to calculate what it would mean to fulfill the goals of the hydrogen strategy. So this was like an attempt to open a debate that we sadly haven't managed to really open because the official policy in Chile has been to continue with this, with the promotion of this energy vector. So what we're seeing now in places like Antofagasta, which is the region in the country that concentrates the most mining. So we have the only lithium extraction plants in the country, and we have the largest open sky copper mine in the world, which is actually here. You can see it in the picture. What we're seeing is that in these same territories that have already been intervened by mining, are now being the focus of new renewable energy infrastructure. And while this might seem like good news, what it's actually doing is increasing the stress in incredibly stressed ecosystems. In this case, for instance, what you see here is a picture from the report we just launched a couple of months ago, where you see one of the salt flats that has been declared exhausted and damaged, irreparably damaged, by the extraction of water for the mine that is next to it. And it's in the same aquifer where new solar plants and transmission lines are being built. And the local communities living there, whose livelihoods depends on the existence of these wetlands, because salt plants are wetlands, have opposed to this project, and they haven't managed to really raise awareness that renewable energy infrastructure has impacts, even if it doesn't have emissions right there where it's being produced. So these are just some examples of things that we have done to raise awareness about this, to do education about the rights that we have to participation. And this was just an example I wanted to share, and that you can check in the report of our foundation. It's free to download. And in this perspective of expansionism, right, of an energy expansion, of more and more, of asking more and more for the global markets, there are some degrowth alternatives. I call them degrowth alternatives. They don't necessarily brand themselves as degrowth. This is absolutely my word. But for instance, I think this report from the Climate and Community Project, which is now Climate and Community Institute, is very interesting because it made this study for the United States where it tried to model what it would mean to think about future lithium demand if we transform the way the transport system works, right? So not just replacing the fossil system you have today with another one, but actually transforming, as you can see here, the size of the batteries, the reducing vehicle ownership. Like, we don't need this many cars. And if you introduce these restrictions, what you can see is that there is a significant reduction on lithium demand. So including these social transformations also means that we can speak about resource extraction in a different way. And I think this kind of research is fundamental to support and to make way for degrowth futures. So I just wanted to finish very quickly with some headlines. This is just a selection of like papers I have read recently that I think are really interesting, especially if you are interested in social policy as I am. So again, some things about why we are so dependent on car and how we can change our systems of provision to make us less dependent on cars and therefore save the flatlands, for instance, that the wetlands, for instance, that we have in Chile. There is already like a huge amount of policy proposals that you can map and you can see, you can compare. Like this paper is really good at that, and insights of how we can reduce our energy demand without giving up on giving a good quality of life to everyone, and different proposals on how this can actually be achieved. So this is very encouraging research. I invite you to maybe look at these papers and learn from them, because I think it's a very refreshing read. So I'm just going to finish now reading these conclusions and then we can discuss. So too often, I think we are caught in the inertia of the pro-growth structures and circuits of extraction. And the first step is to pull the emergency brake. So the first step is really to start asking, why are we taking for granted that we need to sustain this way of life, this fossil way of life into the future? Why do we need to tell communities and territories that their lands need to be sacrificed for the greater good, when this is just not true, when there are alternatives, right? Like, to just make this question over and over again. And to remember that the alternatives are already here, hidden in plain sight, and we just need to start looking at them again and centering on them, on the alternatives, and that research on degrowth is urgent and useful. Having this at hand really helps make the case that we should have a deeper political conversation about the future of energy, for example, in Chile. So in that case, I see degrowth as a toolbox and as an ally in this kind of conversation. And that's it. I'm going to leave it here so we can use the last few minutes to talk. Thank you, and apologies for speaking so fast.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. This was a great presentation. I wanted to remind everyone that you can post questions on the chat or simply raise your hand and ask the question directly. I'm gonna go with the first question asked by Vlad Bunea. Vlad asks, how can degrowth happen in the Global South? And I am specifically interested in the part that doesn't involve aid from the Global North. Should the Global South nationalize all their resources to achieve degrowth?
Should I just go straight into answering? Okay. I mean, there are multiple ways, and I think there is no one single answer. I do think there is a lot of conversation about nationalizing resources, and I think that's probably a step in the right direction, but not so much. I mean, the states can also do a lot of damage. If you go to the north of Chile, the national copper extraction industry is the one that, you know, it's more damaging, and it's being sued for the damages it has done, and you can have a very nationalistic exploitation of resources in the name of collecting revenues, which is what I was trying to explain with this idea of the compensatory state by Gudinas. So what we really need is dismantling of the power of the state, I dare saying, to the local level. The more local, the better, so that the solutions can be grounded in local realities, and the technologies that we implement can provide to that way of living, to sustain the actually existing life of the territories, and not just the commodification. So for me, at least, if we sacrifice or we use all the land in Chile that can produce renewable energy to export hydrogen, this is a loss, right? This is not a good news, because we are we're giving up on doing development or doing well-being differently. We're giving up on the project of Buen Vivir and of sufficiency. So I think that the decision of how that happens and how that happens democratically, it's like the most difficult question of degrowth. Like, how do we make change when change now is so concentrated in corporations, and our states serve the corporations? They are at their mercy because they need the investment, and so they become like these people that have to seduce corporations into investment. And as long as we don't dare breaking that cycle, because it's like a cycle of violence, there is no way other realities and possibilities can emerge. So that's the first step for me, at least. Another thing, like, forgiving the external debt, recognizing the ecological debt. There are other movements that are more macro in their demands, and I think they're also important.
Thank you, Gabriela. And that last part, I think is related to this next question by Greg. Greg says, in an era of rising authoritarianism and right-wing control of information systems, what is the path to getting degrowth ideas into the minds of either large numbers of people or the minds of those who have power?
This is another great question. I mean, I think we need to try all the approaches. For instance, at least, and this is very, very personal, and it depends on where you're standing and who you can speak to. But at least in my own advocacy work or in my work as a researcher, I always try to, I don't know what's the English expression for this. Maybe Claudio can help me. Like el peso de la prueba. How do you say that? Like to shift.
Like the weight of the test?
Yeah, I don't know how. That's a very handy expression in Spanish, but when very often people tell me that I need to prove that degrowth is viable. And what I always try to show is the other way around, that the models that they have are not viable. Like, that exporting 300 gigawatts of energy in the form of hydrogen is not viable. And it's not viable socially, it's not viable ecologically. And the fact that they want that to happen means that they're going to support the violence that will take for that to happen. And if they haven't taken limits into account before, then it means that they're acting irresponsibly as leaders. They're making uninformed decisions. They're making decisions without knowing the risks and without knowing the impacts. And then they hope things can be fixed in the way. So I try to shift things around and say, I'm actually asking to do the sensible thing. I'm asking to planetary boundaries, ecological boundaries to be considered, and then to make decisions and not just throw big numbers and then say, oh, but it's going to be environment friendly, so it's fine. And I think that's a good political strategy, and I hope that those that are potential allies will have the intellectual honesty to recognize that and to factor that into their thinking. But I'm not holding my breath, because so far, at least, I haven't seen that reaction in Chile, and that's very discouraging. So I share the question too. I would like to know, what do you think?
Thank you, Gabriela. Yeah, that's a good point. And as many times people say, like, this is not even sustainable for their own economic model. If we keep going the way we're going, yeah, their own economic systems are not going to continue working for them. Anyways, Jeff asks the following: degrowth, quote unquote, seems like a threatening term to oligarchs and the business community. Has anyone fabricated a term that is a positive alternative to business as usual or sustainable economies? Pavita says, overshoot of planetary boundaries is sometimes used to describe degrowth. But do you have an alternative response?
Wait, so I'm going to answer to this by Jeffrey. So this is a highly political and strategic. In some places, for instance, when I speak with communities affected by energy projects, I don't need to explain them degrowth. I don't need to give them a term. They already know. They have their own concepts. They're doing Buen Vivir, even if they don't call it like that. They have their way of living with their land that is coherent, that it's in reciprocity. But when I speak with the business community, I would like to give them a term that actually unsettles them. because they are going to need to do uncomfortable things if they want to be part of the solution. So I don't think it's good that we want to find, a very sweet pill to swallow. I fear, I have seen many degrowth adjacent concepts like regenerative economy or even circular economy to be quickly co-opted. Like I have heard people speaking about the bioeconomy and speaking about biofuels as the future, and I'm like, no, come on, like you can when a word means it's used as a token of good intentions, then you can stretch it to make it fit everything, and that's not what we want. I mean, this is really about recognizing some things and changing some capitalistic practices. And I think if you're not willing to question capitalism, then it's a non-starter. Like I really think that this should be like the beginning of an honest conversation. But again, this is my own personal take, and wherever you are, if you think that using another word, convivial technologies, for instance, like this is maybe a bit more kind, and if you think that's going to get to people, then you should go for it. I think it really depends on how you move around where you are and who you're speaking to.
Great point. Going to the next question by Michelle. She asks, how does anti-colonial degrowth intersect with Kate Raworth's ideas about donut economics?
I think there's a lot of intersection. I really like Kate's work. I think she's very clear in what she does. I really like her framings. Like, I think it's a good introduction to thinking differently, completely. I do miss sometimes this more political perspective, this need to criticize capitalism and name things for what they are, that I think is very much alive in the degrowth movement, and I would like to see it happen more. And that we question, the relations of property, of ownership, that we rethink our political institutions, and not just that we ask the same institutions and people in power today to do things differently. And I do think that's a bit of a weak point in how this is framed. But again, you choose your battles. Like I hugely respect that work. So I would like to be side by side with that, but also to add this political perspective.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks also for going over the hour. We're a few minutes past the hour. But we wanted to thank you so much, Gabriela, for being here with us today and for giving such a great presentation and answering all our questions. So please, everyone, welcome me thanking Gabriela.
Thank you. Thank you all.